As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Noticing the physiological responses is part of helping you to, if you're suppressing, think about what you want to do to maybe voice your anger in a way that's healthy. Or if you're acting out, thinking about, okay, what do I need to do that's values-based, that maybe isn't about voicing the anger, like yelling or something. I need to take a moment and ground, get in touch with what's happening, and then take an action. So being aware of your physiological arousal can be very helpful in expanding the way you respond to anger.
That was Dr. Robyn Walser on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 3 clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act Daily Journal, the Act Daily Card Deck, and the upcoming book, Act for Burnout.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the book, Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of Act Metaphors, and the upcoming Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. I have our dear friend, Dr. Robyn Walser, on the show today. Robyn is our friend and colleague, and she's been on several episodes of Psychologists Off the Clock before. She's a frequent guest of ours. And in fact, you may recall from previous episodes, if you've listened to her, that she has a lovely French bulldog who you will hear snoring during the episode, which is kind of if you know Robyn, this is a thing with Robyn, is that she always has dogs and they're always super cute and they always snore. So you'll hear them and it's a little bit of a Wild Kingdom moment because you'll also hear some crows in the background. So you can just imagine that you're out in nature listening to crows. But the topic that I'm talking to Robyn about in this episode is anger and forgiveness. Robyn co-authored the ACT workbook for anger. And we've talked about anger on the podcast before, episode 216. And that ended up being a really popular episode of ours because, I mean, who doesn't occasionally struggle with anger? And I think there's so much you could talk about as relates to anger and how we experience anger and how we manage it. And so we wanted to have Robyn to come on and to add more to the conversation on anger and to hear her perspective on it. And I'm here today with Jill, who also knows Robyn and who has listened to the episode. Jill, what are your thoughts?
And who also has a snoring French bulldog, but this time it was not mine in the background.
You have the French bulldog, the ACT connection with Robyn, and the French bulldog connection.
That's exactly right. Well, I love this episode, and I think it's really timely because, you know, with our constant barrage of news, typically bad news, you know, the exposure on social media, everything going on with politics and the divisiveness that we've seen, I think people are feeling angrier than ever before, expressing anger in really unhelpful ways. And so I think this is timely, and I really appreciated the nuance of the discussion in terms of there are different ways anger can be felt and also different reactions to anger. It's not just the big explosive like aggressive expressions. There are other ways that anger can come out. And so I just thought there was a lot of lovely nuance. And I think one of the parts of the conversation I appreciated most was you had a discussion around the function of needing to be right. And I think that that is something that underlies our conversations that get a little heated. And we may not even realize that that's what's going on. And to be able to look at like, what is showing up for you? Like, what would it mean to be wrong? And where is that need to be right coming from? It actually made me laugh because I remembered many years ago, I think it's DBT and Marsha Linehan. There's a like, what's more important, being effective or being right? And I remember sort of teaching that to my husband many years ago, but probably in a way where I was like trying to make a point. And so now he throws it back at me all the time, but he uses it very skillfully because it's sort of this trigger for me to stop and go, oh yeah, I'm getting in that space where I recognize I feel this need to be right. And what am I trying to avoid with that? And is this really what's called for in this context? So I just found that to be really useful.
And there's something so important about this because I think that there's something, I mean, the magical words are, oh, you're right, honey. You know, it's like, it feels so good when you are right. And that there is something sort of that charges you up about that feeling of righteous anger.
Yeah.
It really does. And so I think, but sometimes it gets us into a whole lot of hot water. I mean, really, this can cause a divorce. You know, if you're so locked into like, I'm right about this, that I'm willing to, you know, this is the hill I'm going to die on kind of thing. And so, and there's other ways, obviously, in which, you know, if you think about politics and how that plays out in families, and I've certainly seen that with some of my extended family before. And so it's, while on the one hand, it feels powerful and good to be right and to be righteous, it's not always helping us to really latch onto that.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I tell my husband, you know, if we're having some discussion about something and I say, you were right, he's like, wait, I'm sorry, what? Could you say that again?
Can you put that in writing, please?
Yeah. Like, you were right. And he's like, hold on a second. Let me just soak that in.
Yeah.
But part of the reason for that is that it's hard for me to say that. It's something that I've struggled with for a long time, admitting I'm wrong, apologizing. You know, it's something I recognize in myself that I need to work on. And luckily, you know, he's very funny and uses humor around those kinds of things. And it's like helped me to actually identify these things better.
There are some phrases in the English language that I don't really like. One of them is that there's something like, never say you're sorry or something like that. Like this sort of never apologize kind of vibe. I just don't like that. And another one is forgive and forget because it's not realistic. And the other piece of this conversation that we talk about is forgiveness and how sometimes anger is part of that. Sometimes, you know, forgetting is impossible. And I think sometimes some of these sayings are based on some sort of cultural myth that we somehow come up with. But sometimes those can be very problematic.
Oh, 100%. I totally agree. I mean, I forget frequently why I just walked into a room, but but if, you know, if I feel wronged or something really challenging has happened between two people, it's far less likely that you're going to forget. So yeah, I totally agree. And I thought that your conversation around forgiveness and what it does and doesn't mean, or what it does and doesn't entail, was also really useful. It really added to the conversation you had with Carla McLaren fairly recently. You know, there were some elements added in this conversation with Robyn.
Yeah, that episode with Carla, it is interesting because that's another one. We talked about anger and the wisdom in anger. We also talked about forgiveness and the intersection between anger and forgiveness. So this conversation to me feels like almost an extension of that conversation about the language of emotions.
Yeah, it's amazing how different the conversation was. It complemented that other episode a lot, and that episode felt very thorough and comprehensive. And so when I listened to this, I'm like, oh, see, there's like always more to learn. I just love that. That's why I love the podcast so much. And, you know, I would just add that listen to the end if you want to find out whether Robyn thinks we should set cars on fire.
Intriguing. Intriguing. Well, everyone, enjoy the conversation. My guest today, Dr. Robyn Walser, has appeared frequently as a guest on Psychologists Off the Clock. We're happy to have her back. She's talked to us about a variety of topics, including existentialism, acceptance and commitment therapy, narcissism, and empowering women. She is the author of several books and a renowned speaker and trainer. Her consultation and training service is called Trauma and Life Consultation and Psychological Services. She has expertise on acceptance and commitment therapy, traumatic stress, and moral injury. Currently has an on-demand ACT for trauma training available through Praxis. She also does research on suicide. And Robyn, as I understand it, you have a course coming up soon for clinicians on suicide. Can you tell us a little bit about that for listeners who might be interested?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me on Psychologists Off the Clock again. It's such a pleasure. And
thank you, Robyn.
It's always a pleasure to sit down and chat about things that are important to psychologists and others who might listen. So we're doing a training October 6th through 27th, and it's every Friday between those dates from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's ACT for Suicidal Behavior. I'll be joined by my colleagues, Dr. Sean Barnes and Dr. Lauren Borges.
Both of whom have been on the podcast, I might add. Sean came on and talked about suicide, and Lauren came in and talked to us about moral injury.
Yeah, they're both terrific folks, and I'm really glad to be doing this ACT for Suicidal Behavior training with them. I think it's going to help folks think about how to work with individuals in their practice and hospital settings and clinics who are engaging in suicidal behavior.
And that's a virtual training, is that correct?
Yeah, so it's live training, but online.
Okay. And where can people find out about that online?
Go to praxisset.com. That's praxiscet.com, and click on our courses, and you'll find it there.
Wonderful. That'll be a great training. Thank you, Robyn. And so we're here today to have a conversation with Robyn about anger and forgiveness. One of the many books that Robyn has written, which she co-authored with Manuela O'Connell, is called The ACT Workbook for Anger. So Robyn, thank you again for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about anger and forgiveness.
I'm looking forward to talking about it too. And just a shout out to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Manuela O'Connell, who wrote the book with me. She wanted to be here today, but was unable. And so I'll be speaking for the both of us, I suppose, today.
Yes, it's always tough when there's two authors of a book. It's nice to have both when possible, but sometimes it just is very hard to arrange schedules to make that happen. So she'll be here in spirit.
Yes, we'll have her here in spirit for sure.
Well, actually, that's a nice segue to talk about the way that you start your book, because I think it's very powerful. Both you and Manuela share a little bit about your own histories around anger. And I think it's really important when people are looking at anger, if anger is something that you might be struggling with or grappling with, to take a look at your history, what you learned about anger, how you learned to feel anger and respond to anger sort of growing up. And I was wondering, Robyn, I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal question. Since you put it in the book, I hope it's fair game. But would you be willing to share a little bit about your own learning history as a child?
Yeah, sure, of course. And I do think this is really important for people to consider as they're looking at their own struggles with anger, and what they learned about anger in their youth is going to be really important. So for me, I grew up in a family where I had a relatively explosive father, so he could get pretty angry and sometimes violent. And so having him demonstrate anger in those ways was really impactful in terms of how I thought about anger. It was scary and big and horrible and damaging. And he also gave us messages that he was the only one allowed to express anger in the family. So there was a rule. No one can be mad but me. I'm the only one who can get angry here. And so, we're following those rules, of course, because we didn't want him to get angry at us because it was so big. And it was very impactful. And for me, even though I knew I was feeling anger, I would not express it or show it. I would not talk about my anger as a result of that learning history. And so I always sort of suppressed it and held it back. Sometimes I can get angry or I'll suppress for a while and then suddenly my anger is there in bigger ways than I might want it to be. I guess I should say one other thing that became very clear to me as I observed this from my father is I never wanted to be like that. And so that also sort of informed how I was dealing with my anger emotionally. And not that I ever want to be acting out in ways that are problematic, but learning how to express anger in a way that's healthy and allows you to feel that emotion can be a real challenge for folks like myself.
I share, I would say, some similar history around that. I think Manuela in her story did too, that theme around suppressing anger. I think I felt very scared in the presence of anger too, because of some of my history around it. And to the point where when I first became a therapist, as I was training to become a clinician, if my clients expressed anger, as they sometimes do, I think I kind of froze up a little bit, felt a little panicky. The same was true in my personal life as well. But I had to learn to be in the presence of anger and also to not suppress my own anger so much. And because I think I just always felt like, well, I'm not that angry, but there's anger in there. I think I just kind of bottled it up or just didn't even realize it was there. And, I'm aging and I did some work around this. It's like, I can feel anger more now and be more in touch with it. And I think hopefully, usually in a healthier way. I mean, I have my irritable moments, of course, but generally speaking, to be able to contact that took me some work too.
Yeah, no, I agree. The messages are different for different people, of course, and your learning history will dictate some of that. But there's sort of some kind of general pieces out there that, it's okay for men to be more angry than women, sort of some social messages that are like that. Women shouldn't show anger. They're, crazy if they do, or out of control or something like that. And we can say the same for men, especially if they're acting out. These are very general sort of thoughts that I'm putting out there and don't want to categorize too much because I really want people to get the message that we all feel anger and that it's okay for everybody to have that experience. It's just what you do with it when you have it.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about that in a second. I think those narratives you're talking about, though, which are cultural and which sometimes there are components like gender components, those narratives they stay with us and affect how we respond to anger, how we feel it. It's interesting because, I said I used to be kind of panic or freeze a little bit around it. Now I do anger management work. That's one of the things I offer clients. And so it's kind of funny to go from that to now I love it because you can do so much work with anger.
Yeah.
You can really help people. And I'm hoping to tap into that a little bit today so that people who listen might have a few, ideas and tips that might help them because it is workable. I think I've seen people make a huge shift in terms of how they're able to respond to anger. I don't know about you, Robyn, when you do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And where it sounds like we're going to move in this direction, but I want to make sure we're capturing the social messaging that's out there. And that's a part of our learning history. So that's something to pay attention to as well as not just, what did you learn in your family of origin, but also what were the social messages that you received about anger and what it means about you. And probably one of the things that is going to be very important to convey is that the distinction between feeling it and the behavioral expression of it. Like those are two different things, and most people don't make that distinction. And so I think the social messages don't capture that either. It's just sort of all balled into one big, you can have it or you cannot have it kind of deal. And that misses the range of anger kinds of experiences that you can have that are little bits of burn versus great big burns, and, like little sparks versus bonfires is another way to say it. There's a full range of emotional response here, and lots of messages about what's okay. And I think women don't really get to share that very much. And when they do, they're labeled negatively. Now, of course, if men are behaving violently as a result of anger, there's lots of labels that come along that as well. But there's a lot more room for loud voices of men than there is for loud voices of women. That's sort of that social process that's out there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think sometimes for men, in certain situations, I'm sure this is not universally true, but in certain contexts, that is one of the few emotions that men are allowed to express. Some of those more vulnerable emotions are the ones that are discouraged sometimes among groups of men. So it's sort of interesting, the difference. At least that's been my experience here in the US.
Yeah. And one thing we should say is that there are cultural sensitivities here too, and different messages depending on the culture that people are from and what's okay in this area. So we can be thoughtful about that culture and context. So some of the things that we're talking about are general, but we do want to be thoughtful about those kinds of issues. And the only way to really know is to speak to the individual in front of you and understand their learning history, their social messages, the way they understand it as a personal process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think if you're working on anger in your own life, you can ask yourself, what did I learn about growing up about anger? What's my history there? What messages do I hear about anger in my situation, in my context, my cultural context in the world around me? And just think about, how's that playing out for you? And is there anything unhelpful in there? Because that's sometimes where you come like, wow, I did learn this growing up and it's not helping me. So maybe I need to unlearn that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can unlearn it, but learn something new, right?
Broaden what we've learned. And I think,
yeah,
to be fair as well, if I think about my mom and her modeling of anger, so she would get angry, right? But never in front of my dad. So it was context dependent. She kept it on the down low. And it would usually involve, as I think about it, of course, facial expressions. We can read anger in facial expressions. And some kind of fast walking, if that makes sense, like walking fast, kind of moving around the house in a way where it was clear that there was an energy behind it. And maybe, a little bit of cupboard slamming or setting things down hard. Not very often, but every now and then. So you could tell that something was going on. But she wouldn't say much about what was happening, but you could read it in her body language. And so there again, probably not the most effective way of expressing anger, kind of shut down of the voice, a bottled up voice, but expressed through other actions under the context of my dad being absent. And that was from time to time.
I can picture exactly what you're saying. I feel like I've had moments like that where I'm sort of huffing around, I'm not saying the words out loud, but you can, if you're paying attention to my body language, I'm mad.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. Those nonverbal cues and of expressions of anger. So those are a piece of the behavioral part as well. Yeah. Well, if we talk about the emotion itself, in the book, you really make the point that the feeling of anger, the emotion of anger is not the problem in general, right? So it's a wired in emotion we all have. Could you talk a little bit about that? Why do we have anger? What purpose does it serve? And what does it do for us? Why do we have it? Why is it the case that the emotion itself isn't necessarily the problem?
I think this is a great question. And if you think about needing to be mobilized in the fight, flight, freeze system, we sort of bring it down to some basics that if you're threatened or feel threatened in some way, that anger is got a lot of energy in it, a lot of explosiveness and power behind it. And so anger can serve as a way to reduce threat, essentially. So it's kind of built into our system. And you can think of things that where you might see or experience anger very rapidly, and it actually does serve the purpose of keeping others safe or keeping yourself safe. Like if you saw maybe a child in harm's way and it was something that was pretty unpleasant, you might get really angry and grab the child and pull him out of harm's way. Or like there's a safety quality in it that really gets us mobilized, but shows up a lot under threat. I think that with our system of language and relating to it also can show up when we feel out of control, but that's probably also threat related too, like I'm not in charge and I'm not going to get what I want, and what does that mean about me? I'm more vulnerable in some way. So it has a quality of like pushing against vulnerability, because when we're vulnerable, we don't feel as safe. And so anger can serve a kind of protective function, if that makes sense. But it's a natural experience, right? Like we all experience anger, even those of us who've done lots of mindfulness and compassion. And in fact, sometimes I would even argue that having some compassion might involve some anger. For instance, if you're feeling angry and stirred up about people being harmed and you want to take action on it. So having compassion for those folks who are being harmed might actually involve the experience, an emotional experience of anger.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Sometimes it's helpful in that sense that there's a problem, we need to do something about it, whether it's an injustice or, a threat. We're trying to keep ourselves or someone else safe. I'm just thinking about that piece you said about it feels sometimes out of control, because I think that's really important. I think that's where sometimes people get into problems. Sometimes we need to act fast when that fight or flight system gets going. But sometimes that doesn't really serve us very well in today's modern world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course we have folks who are feeling threatened in some way, and it's about status or being in control or some sort of way of wanting to exert force in their social situations. And then that's not the same as like pulling somebody out of danger or reducing an actual threat to somebody. It's more about protecting an ego, protecting themselves from having some kind of vulnerability.
I have an example of that from the gas station near my house. Actually, I wasn't there when this happened. My husband told me about it. My husband was waiting in line with a group of other people, all waiting to pay for things. And the guy working behind the counter had kind of fumbled with something. And my husband said he thinks he was embarrassed because he was fumbling around there and had dropped something. And there were all these people standing there watching him. And this guy working at the gas station lashed out at this woman that was just there trying to buy something in this kind of surprising way. I think my husband told me about it because he found it a little shocking. And to me, that seems like an example of what you're talking about. Maybe he was in a social situation. He felt flustered, embarrassed. I'm not sure what he felt, but I'm guessing. And his response was to yell at this woman for no reason. And it was kind of striking. Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, like he felt a little vulnerable. He didn't want to feel that vulnerability. And so anger is an avoidance, or can be an avoidance of vulnerability. So it can be you feel some kind of hurt, and to avoid that experience, you move to anger. Yeah. You feel out of control in some way. Yeah.
And I think that's really, your book is an acceptance and commitment therapy approach to looking at anger. And that piece related to avoidance and control, I think that's exactly where it often ends up being problematic for people. So I was wondering if you could maybe just say a little bit more about that from that perspective of the emotion itself isn't a problem, but maybe the control piece of it.
Yeah. So when you think about the two ways that we can avoid emotional expression, there's the one that you and I started with in our personal stories, where we're suppressing it, hiding it, cutting ourselves off from it, trying not to show it, and sometimes even wondering if we feel it, like, am I mad about this or not? Right? Like, that is sort of one way to step away from your emotional experience. So you hide it. And then the other is you're having another kind of emotional experience, vulnerability, and you don't want to be vulnerable. You want to remain in control, and you act on it. You act out on it as an example, where you avoid the vulnerability by getting very big and loud and angry. And people respond to those situations pretty rapidly. Like, anger can get reinforced really quickly. Like, if you want somebody to stop doing something because it's maybe hurting you in some way or making you feel vulnerable in some way, anger is a really quick way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you say something to me, like you're evaluating me, and I hear it as a rejection, and then I get loud and big and forcefully confront you about it, you're more likely to like back off and get quiet. And so then my angry behavior has just been reinforced, and I get to avoid that vulnerability or that rejection that I felt around your evaluation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's that social reinforcement of it. A group of people that I'm surprised have come to me where anger is part of the clinical issue are parents, often mothers of young children, because they're irritable or frustrated or angry and kind of acting in ways they don't want to be acting as a parent that's not consistent with their values. And I think that there's a good example of that in here, that they'll say, honey, go put on your pajamas, or, get your shoes on. We need to leave, like 50 times. And then it's almost like nobody's even hearing it. This is my life too, by the way.
Yes,
I'm not
poor moms and dads, right?
Yes, I have done this so many times. But then you snap, brush your teeth right now. You like lose your mind, and then all of a sudden everyone like jumps up and does the thing, and then you're like, wow, okay. You don't think this consciously, but hey, guess what just worked?
Yeah.
It got everyone's attention. But then, of course, you don't feel good about that because you're like, I don't want to be the mom who's yelling about this,
Yeah, no, but that's a really good example of everybody snaps to it, right?
Yeah.
And then it like reinforces that and happens again and again and again. And I have a lot of sympathy for parents around this place, right? Because we want our kids to behave, right? We want them to engage in good health habits, brush your teeth, go to sleep, like all of these things that are important in helping kids learn and stay healthy. And it's a struggle. Like, how do we do this in ways where we are behaving as the parent we want to behave as, and not getting like over the top angry or yelling all the time or something like that? It takes a dedication and consistency. And I think parents these days have a hard time with that because of time itself, right?
Yeah.
Like, parents are pressured for time. I mean, usually people are working and there's 1,001 things to do. And so you want control because it makes your life easier. And it just is one more tick mark on the things that you have to do. And there's also sort of a sense of future construction here, if you think about it in languaging terms that we do in the ACT world, is once they're in bed, I'll be able to relax, right? I'm going to be able to calm down, and I'm going to get a little break. So there's a lot of motivating factors in there. You want healthy children. You want a little break for yourself. You want to be able to get things done. And so anger is a quick way to make that happen. And so I think it's hard these days for parents to sort of come into this place of patience and thinking about consequences and how to consistently behave with your child so that they are doing what you'd hope they do. But for the parent, it's like control. I need control here. And some degree of that is true. You need to, teach your children things, but acting in ways that are consistent with your values in that territory when you're feeling angry is hard, and it takes work and awareness.
Yeah. So one piece of working with anger is to be really aware of anger, to just really understand it. And I think that's something that in your workbook, you have a number of things that people can look at to just be aware of their own emotions. But you really break it down into 4 main components: feelings, physiological sensations, thoughts, and actions. We've talked a little bit about actions already. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about some of the other components, though, starting with physiological sensations. I actually think, and I imagine, knowing you, Robyn, I imagine you'll agree with me on that sometimes just being aware of the physical sensations of anger can be really helpful. So could you walk through what are some of the common physical sensations of anger people might notice, and how might it be helpful?
Yeah, so some of the common things that folks might notice are feelings of heat, like you can feel yourself turning red or heat, heart rate, breathing increases. You might also experience tension in your muscles. You might, for instance, if you made an angry face, you could feel the experience of that, like the tension maybe in between your eyebrows. People, when they're angry, their mouths tend to turn downward, and so you can feel the sensation of the muscles pulling on your face. And so some people experience these differently, but those are some kind of typical physiological responses. Some other folks report, and they describe this as a physiological experience, a kind of narrowing of their vision. Like they lose their peripheral vision. They might find their fists clenching, or they might find themselves like my mom, walking quickly and moving in a fast fashion. So it can involve the whole body in terms of thinking about the way our body is responding physiologically to this emotional experience. And being aware of those can be really super helpful for people, because sometimes folks are not paying attention to what's going on with their body at all. They're not looking at the signals that show this kind of arousal. They're kind of caught in their minds and, thinking about this shouldn't be happening, or, what's going on here? I need to fix this, or whatever it is that is running through their mind in that moment. And if we can get people to just slow down a little bit, it doesn't take much, just a little bit, a second or two, and connect with their physiological experience, it's a place where maybe they could choose to do something different. Noticing the physiological responses is part of helping you to, if you're suppressing, think about what you want to do to maybe voice your anger in a way that's healthy. Or if you're acting out, thinking about, okay, what do I need to do that's values-based, that maybe isn't about voicing the anger, like yelling or something. I need to take a moment and ground, get in touch with what's happening, and then take an action. So being aware of your physiological arousal can be very helpful in expanding the way you respond to anger.
Yeah, it helps with that out of control feeling you were talking about earlier, to notice it in your body. Then you can say, I'm angry. And then you can pause, like you said, and choose a response that's less automatic, that might be more values consistent. And so if you tune into your body, it builds that in, which I think is really helpful. It feels like somehow it's not as powerful if you're like, oh, I'm feeling hot and tense, I'm angry, than if you're like, just, explode.
Well, and I think one other thing to pay attention to here, too, is that if you're working with people who are really struggling with acting out on their anger, like, I work with a fair number of veterans, and they'll describe their anger as going from 0 to 100 in like a split second, right? So it's one of those very intense and quick experiences, and they say, there's no way I can intervene on that. Like, it's from the 0 to 100 and it's done, it's over with, I've exploded. And so you kind of feel as a clinician, like, well, how do I even start then? If they're going from 0 to 100, how do I help them get in control of this behavior? And often folks who have this kind of experience really do think there's no way. But if you ask them to do a very slowed down and look at the seconds before the 0, right? When they say 0 to 100, and you actually back up time just slowly before the 0, you'll start discovering that there are things that are indicating and telling you that you're about to hit that space. And some of that is physiological stuff, right? And so people are not attending to the pre-0 space. And if you start looking at that pre-0 space, you might find that, what if you said something there and did something there? Or even sooner than that, like you back it up even further. And so sometimes when I'm working with clients, I'll say, let's look at the seconds, the minutes, the hour, the day even, and what's kind of leading up to this place where you go from 0 to 100. And probably what you'll discover is a number of places along the way where you could take a different action that stops that 0 to 100 place that feels so out of control.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think of it. This is giving me a thought about road rage and how sometimes it just feels like this instant rage situation. And it happens fast, you're barreling down the highway. But if you back up, usually there's something, like maybe you're afraid because you're driving fast and someone cut you off or something. You know what I mean? There's something in there. It feels so fast. But if you really break it down, what happened right before that? Can you tune into that? And that's where I think it goes back to what you're saying. Sometimes there's other emotions also happening, but rage is so strong that you don't notice those other feelings, Oh yeah, it was pretty scary when I was driving down the highway and someone swerved.
Yeah.
Does that mean I need to go chase them down on the highway and
no,
get into a violent altercation? No.
Yeah, well, road rages can be a terrible problem. My brother just shared with me that 2 vehicles were in a road rage altercation on the road, and they hit a third vehicle, and all 3 people in that third vehicle died.
Oh.
And so you really have to think about what's happening here. And it can be multiply determined, but I think part of it is that there's rules about how you behave on the road, and you don't ride on somebody's bumper is a rule. You're supposed to, when you take your driving courses, you learn the rule that you stay so many feet back from the bumper. So when somebody's up on our bumper, we get frustrated because they're not following the rules. And that can set off an instance of road rage. And we do something like slam on the brake and, wave our fists and those kinds of things. We're teaching that person a lesson, right? Mm-hmm. It's about control. It's that space of I feel vulnerable here. You're not following the rules. I'm going to teach you a lesson. When actually probably the more reasonable thing and safe thing to do is just to pull over in another lane and let that person pass, because the person behind you is, doing whatever they're going to do. And so that's part of it, right? It's like we want people to be socially responsible. And when they aren't doing that, it's hard for us. Or we're caught up in our own rush where I've got to get there. We don't leave enough time to do it, and we're burning the gas to get where we're going. We want people to get out of the way. So that's another way that can happen. We get mad when they're just driving, right? Or we accidentally do things, like maybe we accidentally cut someone off, or maybe somebody's in a hurry and they cut us off, and we attribute negative reasons to them, right? Like we call them names and they're not paying attention and they're bad drivers and
they're an idiot.
They're idiots. Right. It makes me think of, I think this was George Carlin who said that everybody driving faster than me is a maniac and everyone driving slower than me is an idiot.
That's so good. That's perfect. I love that.
Right? And so when you're on the road, look at that maniac go, and then, oh, look at that idiot. So there's a very funny experience in there, and we feel isolated. And so there's a power thing inside of our vehicles too, where we kind of assume that other people won't do things, but that's not always the case. So we act out on our anger, and then many of us will instantly regret it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why did I do that? Why was I acting that way? That's not how I want to be. And I was just recently in Thailand, I was thinking about this, and there's a lot of vehicles on the road, and the little small vehicles, I can't think of the name of them right now, but they're just these little tiny vehicles, and they're just coming from everywhere and cutting in. But you know what? No honking, no shaking of fists. People were just letting the traffic flow as it flowed and making way and allowing. And I was just like, oh, we need the Thai way of driving in many of these situations. But there's, of course, ways to work on road rage as well that involve awareness. And how do I want to be when I'm driving?
Well, and I think you gave a few examples of this, but I wanted to talk about the role of thoughts here a little bit more. I think you gave some examples in this road rage examples. That's one of the aspects of anger to be aware of when we get very stuck in certain thinking patterns that may contribute or that could result from that immediate threat response. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to add about that, about, I guess, basically the types of thoughts and beliefs that might show up related to anger that people can be on the lookout for.
Well, so it does depend again on whether you're suppressing or whether you're acting out on it. And so, when you think about suppressing, there's sort of this, do I have the right to be angry, or I shouldn't behave this way? Or you have self-doubt about your emotional experience, or you might sort of run thoughts around in your mind quietly where you can hear the complaints in your head, but you're not acting on it in any way, and you just sort of shut down. But it doesn't mean you aren't still having thoughts, but they may be more self-directed or more like self-doubtish, or they might have qualities of, if I get angry, it's going to be terrible and nothing's going to happen anyway. I'm ineffective, inefficient. Some of those kinds of thoughts might be happening. And by the way, I want to say that there's crossover and not clear distinctions about these kinds of things. But for folks who are acting out, the thoughts might be about how unfair things are in some way, shape, or form. People have broken rules that I have and that I don't want them to break. And I'm right about this. I'm right about the way things should be, and they're wrong, and I'm going to show them that I'm right. And so thoughts that are kind of in those territories. Not very much, a lot of rigidity around right, wrong, good, bad, fair, unfair, that they can get caught up in as a way to try to control.
So maybe we can use righteous thinking, that I'm right or things shouldn't be this way type thinking as an example for how you might address that. Let's say you were working with a client on anger and there were themes of, well, I'm right about this and the world is wrong, or this other particular person is wrong. Because I think that idea, that underlies anger so often, right? That, well, my way is correct and the world is not behaving accordingly. So how might you work with that with someone who wanted to do some anger work?
Well, I do think that one of the first things I want to do, as you might in any act work, is understand their values, and first, get those clarified and defined, and then ask questions about what happens for you. What do you get or receive from being right? If you get to be right, or if there's a fairness in this, what happens for you? And Usually it involves things like people can see and understand me. Things will go more smoothly. Things will go my way. Relationships will be easier because people will get where I'm coming from and I won't get in these places, right? So there's sort of this kind of sense of ease and peace and acceptability in some way. And if you kind of pursue, like, what will you get if you're right? Because largely, and then you can compare and contrast. So in being right, is that what you get? Let's look at the two places, sort of doing a little bit of a discrimination task, like coordinating these two events and looking at how they're actually playing out. And I might do some creative hopelessness work then here around, is this actually getting you where you want to go? Is it getting you this value and acceptance? And if people are acting out, it's often they're not getting those things and people are rejecting them more and pulling away from them more. And then they get into it's not fair and they don't understand me and the world doesn't get it. And so you can either go further down that path or look at how you might change your behavior and broaden your understanding of things and invite other ways of seeing the world. And so you could do a fair bit of perspective taking. And, your shoes, their shoes, the person's shoes that they're angry with, or just different ways of kind of understanding and interacting with the thing that they actually want that's values-based and meaning-driven versus that sense of I need to be in control. For suppression of anger, I also want to know, like, what are your values here? But in relation to you, how do you want to treat you in this process? What do you want your voice to be about and stand for in the world? And what are the fears that are there if you let your voice be heard? And again, it's things like I'll be rejected, I won't be accepted, I won't fit, I'll be ostracized, I'll be labeled crazy or whatever. And so you have to start looking at what would a voice that's not suppressed look like, and how might you express your experience of anger in ways that are appropriate to the context and honor your values of yourself. There's sort of an in and out that I'm doing here. Suppression that's about the way you treat yourself, and then for acting out the way others are being treated that turns out to be problematic. Although both of them are problematic, both in and out as well, but just a little distinction in where the focus might be.
Well, I love that you address both of those, because I think when people hear, oh, you have an anger book out there, or terms like anger management, they assume it's the acting out kind. But, if you're really this workbook for anger, you're really processing different types of anger and different ways it might be showing up. So I think that's important. That's an important distinction, but also important to take a look at both sides of that.
Yeah. And, when you think about right and wrong, like righteousness, like I kind of want to make a little bit of distinction here, is that there may be times where there's a righteous anger that does call for a little bit of acting out, but not harmful acting out. Like you want to think about what that means. Like social movements sometimes contain these qualities when there's a lot of injustice. And it can serve a function. It raises awareness to some of the struggles that people have. And we just have to think about how we want to be in that space. If you look at the Women's March on Washington, D.C. in 2017, there's a lot of anger, but also a very peaceful demonstration. But I got just my own experience of, what was happening at that time. And which, by the way, that turned out to be a worldwide march, which was really cool, of women marching. This is my expression of anger regarding oppression and suppression of women. And I'm going to make my voice heard by showing up here. And I'm going to carry the signs and say this isn't okay. And so, again, this is context dependent, and you have to think about how do I want to be in the context and what kind of actions do I want to take. I never support violence, but sometimes I can sort of connect with why people might set a car on fire. It's not good. I'm not saying to do that, but just like you get your kids' attention when you yell, you get people's attention when you set a car on fire. And so there's lots of nuances and subtleties and important things to keep in mind. And typically this becomes a problem for people, not in a single social injustice kind of space, but when they're suppressing and acting out in places that are like family members, in relationships, friendships, their social arena, in ways that are preventing authenticity or damaging the relationships through violent actions.
Yeah. I'm glad you made that point. I wanted to ask you about that because you do mention in your book, if you think about values, sometimes anger can be helpful in the sense that it fuels pro-social behavior. It helps people be aware of something that they care deeply about. And so that values-based distinction around, okay, why am I feeling this and what do I do with it? And that can be a helpful use of anger in terms of the behavioral piece of it.
It can be quite motivating, anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely lights a fire sometimes, doesn't it?
It lights some fires sometimes and can actually produce social change. So again, you always want to look at the function and whether it's workable. So if you're throwing things at your house or hitting people or yelling and screaming, it's probably getting you the opposite of what it is that you want.
Yeah.
And so it's not functioning the way you want. So what are we going to do to help it take on a different function? And that's probably going to mean a behavior change for both suppressors and those who act out, right? Like they're going to have to consider, how do I want to raise my voice, if I can use that as a metaphor? And how do I want to lower my voice, if I can use that as a metaphor? So that I become more effective socially and more effective in the relationships that I really care about.
I want to turn the conversation a little bit now toward forgiveness. And I'll point to our listeners toward a recent episode with Carla McLaren, who wrote the book, The Language of Emotions, because we talked about a little bit about forgiveness in that conversation. And she had an interesting take on it. And it reminded me of Robyn, of your work on forgiveness, which has been really influential on me back when, you did a lot of training with me back when I was at the VA, and, we were working together on the Act for Depression trainings that we were doing. You shared a lot about forgiveness that I have carried with me and used with my clients, used in my own life. Specifically, a lot of it was related to your work on trauma and moral injury. So I would love to share a little bit with our listeners about that, if that's okay with you, Robyn.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay. Starting with, what do you mean by forgiveness? I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it, even the way that people talk casually about forgiveness. So in your mind, what do you mean when you're talking about forgiveness?
Well, so let me start by saying that I think forgiveness can be quite healing. So if you have somebody who has suppressed for a long time, you may need to forgive yourself. And if you're someone who's acted out, you may need to forgive yourself and forgive others. And so it can have a healing quality to it. But I do approach it from a pretty different angle in terms of looking at the word itself, forgive, and breaking apart. And actually, I got to give credit to Steve Hayes, because he's one of the first persons who talked to me about this many years ago, probably back in 1992 or something like that. But, to give what came before the harm back, to give back. And so if you look at to forgive, and giving is an action, right? It's an activity. Giving isn't a feeling. Do you see what I'm saying? And typically what people do is they think about forgiving as a felt experience after you've said something like, I forgive you, and you've let somebody off the hook for some harm that they've done to you. I forgive you for that. And those words are great, can actually help to heal the relationship. And the emotional experience that comes inside of that can feel like a sense of lightness, or a burden has been lifted in some way. But if people check their experience, and maybe you have felt this too, Deb, where you do the forgiveness and then you think about the harm or the thing that happened and you're mad again. Have you ever had that happen?
Oh, yes. Have I ever? Yeah. You think, okay, I'm going to forgive now. And then 5 minutes later, you're back to mad. Yeah.
Yeah. The emotional experience that comes along with this is fluid and changing. Like, I think about my relationship with my father, for instance, and there's a lot that I've forgiven him for. But it doesn't mean that I still don't get angry about some of the things that I saw him do and some of the things he did. Like, I can call to memory some of the events and get upset about it again and feel angry about it. And so we can't rely on the emotional experience of forgiveness as a signal of forgiveness, I don't think, because then you're forgiving, not forgiving, forgiving, not forgiving. If it's about being angry, the emotion of anger, or the thoughts that you have about it, but rather as a values-based action or activity. If I'm going to forgive, I'm going to offer the interpersonal relationship, the process that was in place before the harm. So, for instance, if let's say you and I were going to go out and get a glass of wine, right?
Okay,
and
do it.
I showed up and you didn't. I might feel dismissed, upset, and maybe it was an important thing for me, and I'm mad about it, and then I forgive you. Then the thing that I'm going to do as an activity is treat you the same way I treated you before that happened. And my friendship is back in its place. Does that make sense? So I'm not carrying chips on my shoulder. I'm not reminding you of it. I'm not like giving you the cold shoulder or distancing myself from you. I am taking actions, values-based actions that are about our relationship again, that are actions, not feelings. Maybe I'm thinking about it and I get upset again, but it's not going to determine the quality of our relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're moving forward in your relationship with me.
Yeah.
You might still have moments when you remember, right? I mean, that forgive and forget saying drives me a little bonkers, because it's like, you want to forget, you would remember, and you might feel miffed at me for doing that. You were waiting there and I never showed up. And you can still stay friends with me and make another plan with me and call me or something like that.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Okay. Does it always involve continuing the relationship with the person in every circumstance, do you think?
No, it can involve other kinds of actions and activities. So, for instance, let's say that you've been in a harmful relationship with someone where maybe they have physically harmed you, and you decide that you're going to forgive them. It doesn't mean you have to go back to the relationship with that person, but instead, what does it mean for you in terms of your actions and moving forward? That would be symbolic in action of that forgiveness. And it might be things that involve a kind of letting go, where I'm no longer going to spend time disparaging that person, or I'm no longer going to get wrapped up with my own time in thinking about how things should have been different in the past, but be more present and forward looking in it. Some people might do other things, like my act of forgiveness in this is to contribute to domestic violence shelter. Like, there's other ways that you can sort of take actions around that, or I'm going to help other women. I mean, the things you can do are without numbers, just using your own creativity and deciding how you want to give in ways that represent that forgiveness, that don't involve reconnecting with the individual who harmed you. Because I wouldn't recommend, right, that, people forgive and then get back in dangerous, painful, traumatic, harmful relationships, right? Like that's absolutely not what this is about. And so I want to be very clear about that.
Yeah, so it could be more moving forward in your own life in a particular way that you choose. And then finally, what about self-forgiveness? So if the person that you're not forgiving is yourself for something that you did, moral injury we've talked about on the podcast, and I know that you have done work in that area. You've done something. I can think of things I've done that I still, when I think about it, I'm like, struggle to forgive myself, What does self-forgiveness look like for people?
Well, so I would define it in the same way. Give back to yourself a healthy, values-based relationship that was there before the harm. And then notice that when you remember those things, that's going to show up from time to time. I mean, I've clearly done things that I've regretted. And is it okay to forgive myself for some of those things? And I'm ashamed or embarrassed about them in some fashion. And when I recall them to mind right now, like little tendrils of shame can show up. And so the deal is that then I go hide and pull away and run and do things that are not compassionate? Or can I be compassionate towards myself and continue to act in ways towards myself as if I had not done that thing? And I know sometimes that's hard, but if you think about values and meaning, if I'm like continuing to punish myself in some way, it's not only impacting me, it's probably impacting people around me. If every time I come in front of you, I'm ashamed and punishing and self-punishing, it has a different quality to our relationship than if I am compassionate towards myself in those spaces where I need to self-forgive. So it's the same idea, it's just that you turn it towards yourself. And I'm going to treat myself as if. And how would I behave in relationships as if? Like when you think about it with moral injury, right? Some of what happens for folks who've had a moral injury is that they have violated their own values, and then they can either forgive themselves and move back into relationships in values-based, meaningful ways. But that's often not what happens. They start punishing themselves and say they deserve to suffer and that they're evil or, somehow there's something really wrong with them. And they have partners and children and families and friendships. And if you're coming from the place of, I'm evil, and if I touch you, you will get it, or, it really changes what meaning you're creating. And so moving back to that values-based space towards self and other can really be, if not healing, a different way of creating the life that you want to live.
Well, I would love to talk to you about this more, but I know that we have gotten to the end of our time here. I'll let our listeners know. I just find this to be such a helpful way to think about it. And I have used this framework with a number of clients over the years because I have seen that self-punishing or just being held at that place for so long. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And if you want to learn more, you have a whole chapter on forgiveness in the Act for Anger workbook, because clearly that is one path toward healing if you're finding yourself in this place of anger. So really appreciate your thoughts on that, Robyn.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me again, and really had fun talking about anger and forgiveness and the ways that we can experience it and still have our values in place, behaviorally speaking.
Well, thank you. I feel like there are so many helpful parts of this conversation. I appreciate it. And I'll just quickly remind the listeners to check out the show notes for today's episode. We'll link, of course, to the book and to Robyn and all of her resources, as well as to some of those trainings that Robyn mentioned earlier, her Act for Suicidal Behaviors training and her trauma trainings that are available on demand. So many wonderful resources. If you are interested in this, you don't want to miss a training with Robyn. She's the best. And so it's really nice to see you, Robyn. Thanks again for coming on.
So good to see you too, Debbie. I look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, and our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.